Everyone who visits Amsterdam, the enchanting capital of the Netherlands, will undoubtedly notice the elegant buildings rising between narrow streets, the interwoven canal system that transforms the city into a work of art, and that unique Dutch architecture greeting you at every corner. However, when you move away from the central areas heavily frequented by tourists and walk toward the eastern neighborhoods of the city, you'll notice a very interesting detail on the street signs. Sumatra, Borneo, Bali, Java. These aren't typical Dutch names, but rather the names of Indonesian islands thousands of kilometers away. So why do these names from a completely different geography exist in the heart of the Netherlands, in the north of the European continent? This seemingly simple question takes you back 400 years to struggles for maritime dominance, incredible wealth, and ultimately a tragic collapse. This is the story of perhaps the most powerful commercial organization the world has ever seen. Not just a money-making company, but a power with its own army, navy, and even its own justice system. Its name is VOC, officially Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or the Dutch East India Company. Our story begins in 16th century Europe. At that time, the continent operated with an economic dynamic we can barely imagine today. Spices, yes, the ordinary black pepper, cinnamon, and cloves you use in your kitchen, were worth as much as gold back then, sometimes even more. Why? Because these spices prevented meat from spoiling, added flavor to meals, and were even believed to cure certain diseases. But most importantly, they were status symbols. If you had spices on your table, it meant you were wealthy. Europe's trade centers at that time were the cities of Bruges and Antwerp in what is now Belgian territory. These ports were overflowing with merchants from all corners of Europe: Italians, Germans, French, English, and of course, Portuguese, us the greatest naval power of the era. Portugal had been systematically exploring the world since the late 1400s. First, they mapped the African coasts, then rounded the Cape of Good Hope, then reached India, and finally found the Spice Islands in Indonesia. These islands were the primary source of pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. The Portuguese kept this route secret. Their maps were state secrets. Navigation information was guarded like treasure. Now let's look at the Netherlands' situation at that time. The Netherlands wasn't the independent country we know today. Together with present-day Belgium and Luxembourg, it was under the rule of the Spanish crown, and Spain was part of the Habsburg Empire, the superpower of that era. But there was a serious problem: religion. The Dutch were beginning to adopt Protestantism, while the Spanish were staunch Catholics. This wasn't just a religious disagreement. It was a matter of identity, freedom, and independence. Tensions escalated and erupted in 1566. The Dutch War of Independence, known as the 80 Years' War, had begun, but the Spanish didn't stop at military pressure. They also began economic strangulation. In 1591, the Portuguese, who had merged with Spain at the time, in collaboration with the powerful German banking families Fugger and Welser, diverted the spice trade away from Dutch ports. Ships coming to Antwerp and Bruges were cut off. Trade was redirected to Hamburg. For the Dutch, this meant disaster. Not just loss of income, but their entire economic system was under threat. Moreover, as the Portuguese couldn't meet the growing demand, spice prices were soaring. There was hunger in the market, but the Dutch were left out. It was at this exact moment that some brave Dutch merchants made a radical decision. Since they won't sell us spices, we'll go get them ourselves. But there was a problem. No one knew how to get to Indonesia. The Portuguese guarded their sea routes, currents, wind patterns, and maps, showing dangerous rocks as state secrets. Here begins a real espionage story. Dutch agents worked covertly to obtain Portuguese maps. Bribery, theft, deception, every means was acceptable. Finally, in 1595, they succeeded. The maps were verified, a fleet was prepared, and the first Dutch expedition of 4 ships set sail under the partial leadership of Cornelis de Houtman. This first voyage was a complete nightmare. When they arrived at the port of Banten in Java in June 1596, the Portuguese and local people didn't welcome them at all. The Dutch were inexperienced, didn't know diplomacy, were aggressive. Conflicts broke out. While tropical diseases ravaged the crew, supplies ran out. Half the crew died. But when they returned to the Netherlands in 1597 with even a small amount of spices, a miracle happened. The goods they brought still made a profit. This was the ray of hope. Most importantly, they had learned the route. In 1598, this time a fleet of 8 ships set sail under the command of Jacob van Neck. This voyage was much more successful. Van Neck reached the source directly, the Maluku Islands, Spice Islands. By bypassing Javanese intermediaries, they traded traded directly with producers. When they returned between 1599 to 1600, they achieved incredible success, 400% profit. However, everyone was aware of one fact: these voyages were extremely risky. Imagine a single investor investing all their money in one ship. If that ship sinks in a storm, if pirates attack, or if the crew dies from disease, what happens? Everything is lost. The solution was ingenious but simple: spread the risk. Everyone should invest their money, not in one ship, but in many ships. Even if one ship sinks, the others will profit. On average, there's always gain. This is one of the foundations of modern finance theory: portfolio diversification. The English implemented this system in 1600 by founding the East India Company. The Dutch did the same in 1602, albeit 2 years late, but the Dutch went even further. The VOC, officially founded on March 20th, 1602, was one of history's most extraordinary organizations. It wasn't a normal trading company. It was half state, half private sector. The Dutch government had given it incredible powers. It could declare war. Yes, a company could wage war against other countries and powers. It had its own army and navy. It could arrest, judge, and execute criminals. It had its own prisons. It could sign agreements and treaties as if it were an independent state. It could mint its own money. It could acquire land and establish colonies. A board of directors consisting of 17 principal shareholders controlled the company from the Netherlands. Operations in Asia were managed by the Governor General. The first permanent trading post was established in Banten in 1603, but the real turning point came in 1611. Where present-day Jakarta stands, there was a small port town. When the first Governor General, John Petersoon Cohen, arrived here, he made a visionary decision. He would make this VOC's Asian headquarters. He named the city Batavia, the Latin name for ancient Dutch tribes. Batavia wasn't just a trading center, it was a fortress city. It was surrounded by walls, had a garrison, courts, prisons, churches. A miniature Amsterdam had been created in a tropical climate. Canals were dug just like Amsterdam. Dutch-style buildings were constructed. But VOC wasn't alone in the region. There were competitors too. The English East India Company had established numerous trading posts in the Spice Islands in the 1610s. Sometimes they cooperated with the Dutch, sometimes they competed, but tensions were gradually increasing. In 1623, a horrific incident occurred on Ambon Island. VOC officials suspected that the English were plotting to seize control of the trading post. There was almost no evidence, but paranoia had taken hold. 21 people, 10 of them English, the others Japanese and Portuguese, were arrested. Then torture began. Brutal torture was inflicted to force confessions of guilt. Eventually, all 21 people were executed. This Ambon massacre created deep hatred between England and the Netherlands. The diplomatic crisis lasted for years and became one of the main causes of the First Anglo-Dutch War in 1652. VOC didn't limit itself to spices. It built a complex trading network. Ships from the Netherlands transported supplies to bases in Asia. These supplies were exchanged in Japan for precious metals, especially silver and copper. Japan was the world's largest silver producer at that time. These precious metals were bartered in China and Mughal India for silk, cotton, porcelain, and luxury textiles. These products were either sold within Asia in exchange for spices or taken to Europe and sold at much higher prices. Portuguese dominance began to collapse. VOC systematically seized Portuguese bases. Most importantly, they took control of Dejima, an artificial island off Nagasaki. For over 200 years, this was the only place where Europeans could trade with Japan. VOC earned incredible profits thanks to this monopoly. In 1652, another strategic move was made. Jan van Riebeck established a supply station at the southern tip of Africa. Ships on long Asian voyages would stop here for fresh water and supplies. This small base eventually grew into the Cape Colony, then Cape Town. VOC wasn't just after money. The scientific curiosity of the Dutch Golden Age had infected the company as well. In 1609, they hired English navigator Henry Hudson. His mission? Find a route to Asia through the Arctic Ocean. Hudson couldn't pass through the ice, but turned west. He thought perhaps there was a passage through North America. In this search, he mapped the northeastern coasts of present-day Canada and the eastern shores of America. He sailed up a river at the mouth of what is now known as the Hudson River. New Amsterdam was later founded. This settlement would eventually grow into New York. The coasts of Australia and New Zealand were also mapped by VOC explorers. Explorers like Willem Janszoon and Abel Tasman discovered these regions while searching for the legendary Great Southern Continent. Although the Dutch didn't establish permanent colonies there, their maps were were invaluable for future generations. By 1669, VOC had reached incredible proportions. 150 large merchant ships, 40 warships, 50,000 employees, 10,000 strong private army. It was the richest private company in world history. It distributed a 40% annual dividend to its investors, an incredible figure by today's financial standards. It was an organization worth billions of dollars in today's money. But by the 1670s, growth had stopped. Japan restricted precious metal exports. This disrupted VOC's entire Asian trade because the system depended on silver and copper. The English East India Company was also growing stronger. 4 separate Anglo-Dutch wars broke out in the second half of the 1600s. These wars threw trade routes into chaos and increased costs. VOC employed a clever strategy. It flooded the market with goods, especially pepper. They poured tons of pepper into Europe. Supply increased, prices fell. The English became unable to profit and had to withdraw from the market. VOC won, but this was a Pyrrhic victory. The problem was this: Europe's tastes were changing. People now wanted completely different things instead of spices. Tea had become fashionable in England. Coffee was spreading across Europe. Sugar demand exploded. Cotton textiles were popular. In 1684, VOC had to close its main pepper center in Banten. They established new bases on the Indian coast, but weren't successful. In 1721, they abandoned that venture too. New strategy: instead of small quantities of very expensive goods, large quantities of cheaper goods. A shift from high margin, low volume to low margin, high volume. But this required significant expansion. Between 1680 to 1720, VOC doubled its fleet. The tonnage of ships returning increased by 125%, but the profits only increased by 78%. There was no linear growth. Costs were rising rapidly while profits lagged behind. Debts multiplied. When Japan stopped selling silver, loans were taken to obtain precious metals from other sources. Interest accumulated. Profit margins fell. Dividends decreased. But investors were still hopeful. Share prices reached record levels in the 1720s. Truly ironic, because the company was rotten from within. The 18th century was a slow death process for VOC. Some problems were external: the decline of intra-Asian trade, cheap sugar competition from the West Indies and Brazil. There wasn't much that could be done about these, but the real problem was internal. Incompetent leadership, widespread corruption, financial collapse. The worst example occurred in 1740. A rumor spread in Batavia that the Chinese community would revolt. There was no evidence, but paranoia spread rapidly. VOC officials and the native Javanese people together began horrific violence. The result? Over 10,000 innocent Chinese people were massacred. The city turned into a pool of blood. This Batavia massacre completely destroyed VOC's reputation. Not just in Asia, but even in the Netherlands, the reaction was very harsh. An official investigation was launched. Governor General Adriaan Valkenier was arrested and died in his cell before trial. In 1780, the company was still large, but it was a sick giant. Reform plans were prepared, but it was too late. That year, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War broke out. The balance had completely changed. 100 years had passed since the Third Anglo-Dutch War, 1670s. During this time, the English had far surpassed the Dutch. The Royal Navy was now master of the world. The English attacked mercilessly. VOC ships were captured. Valuable cargoes seized. Bases in Cape Colony, India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia were occupied. VOC was defenseless. The war ended in 1784. The English behaved gentlemanly in the Treaty of Paris and returned the territories they had captured, but with one condition: free trade in the Dutch East Indies. VOC's monopoly was gone. Its competitive advantage was zeroed out. The Netherlands was in financial ruin. No loans could be found to keep VOC afloat. The company's debts had reached astronomical levels. March 1st, 1796. The Batavian Republic, the Netherlands, under French occupation, officially nationalized VOC. The glorious 194-year story had ended. Those street names still stand in Amsterdam's eastern neighborhoods today. Sumatra, Borneo, Java, Bali, each one a memory, a reminder. The traces of the world's most powerful company. VOC's legacy isn't just in street names. It laid the foundations of modern corporate structure. It popularized the stock system. It provided the first examples of risk management. It wrote the rules of global trade, but also a dark legacy: colonialism, slavery, massacre, exploitation. The Indonesian people suffered for centuries. The Chinese community was destroyed. Economies were exploited. When walking on Sumatra Street in Amsterdam today, remember this dual legacy, both an incredible success story and a human tragedy. Because history teaches us this: every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually falls. The question is, what does it leave behind.